Welcome to the Craftsman Founder Podcast, hosted by Lucas Carlson. Every week, we talk to founders, entrepreneurs, and those who've made a craft out of creating companies and enterprises. Listen every week to get ideas for starting, promoting, and growing your business. There are no shortcuts, just good old-fashioned hard work and craft. So sit back, relax, and enjoy this week's interview.
Hello, this is Lucas Carlson.
And Elliot Pepper.
And this is the Craftsman Founder Podcast. This week we have a very, very special return guest for you. One of my absolute favorite podcast episodes with David S. Rose. Look it up because it was such a fun, exciting episode. I really, really enjoyed it. And this week we have another appearance by the great man himself, David S. Rose, because he has a brand new book, The Startup Checklist. I really enjoyed this book because it did, for entrepreneurs, go through every single point of what you should be doing in what order. I think that's one of the most interesting things that, as mentioned in the book, there's tens of thousands of books on entrepreneurship out there. And so why write another one? And I think that David S. Rose has really created something that is different. It stands out. And if you are really wanting to do entrepreneurship and you're serious about it, going through his checklist, I wish I had it when I had started my first startup because it does everything in the right order. So David, thank you for joining us again, and I appreciate you coming on the show.
Well, it's my pleasure. Thank you, Lucas and Elliot. It's great to be back. And thank you for those lovely words about the startup checklist. So I feel honored. I mean, I want to go out and read the book now. So.
Me too. So, David, could you give us kind of a 10,000-foot overview of some of the major steps and in what order you should be approaching them as an entrepreneur?
Sure. Well, so the first question you raised is that, why on earth did anybody need another book? And so when Wiley first approached me after the success of my first book, Angel Investing, to do a book for entrepreneurs, I said, that's the last thing the world needs. And they noted that, first of all, a lot of people who were buying my first book on angel investing, which was directed toward angel investors as the how-to book, were actually entrepreneurs who were reading it to find out what the angels were actually thinking about. And they actually found it really useful to see from the nitty-gritty, from the deep dark side of the other side of the table. And so I said, okay, but let me look and see what's there. And as I note in the preface to the new book, I found 93,250 books or whatever on Amazon all about starting a company. And so I figured, okay, well, forget that. But then I actually looked more closely at it, and it turned out that there were two large groups of books within those 93,000. One of them are a set of books that have been around in varying editions for probably 20, 30, 40 years. And those were, how to start a company, but they're designed for the typical American small business. How do I set up my local dog walking service? How do I, become an LLC as a graphic designer or a pool cleaner or whatever, or a local hardware store or a coffee shop? And those were sort of very hands-on and how-to, and here's the paperwork you file, and so on and so forth. And they were great. But on the other hand, the people we usually deal with are these super high-growth entrepreneurs who think they're everybody, all of us, you, me, and everybody else, think that we're all the next, Elon Musk, or Steve Jobs, and we're trying to grow unicorns. And for those, there was a whole new category of books which had begun to appear about 10 years ago with books from Guy Kawasaki and others, and then it picked up steam with Eric Ries's The Lean Startup and Steve Blank's The Startup Owner's Manual, and some really great books about Peter Thiel's 0 to 1 and so on. And so with all those books, they were aimed at the right kind of people, except that because they were all done by these great hotshot entrepreneurs and authors, they were all what I call high concept books. How do I find product market fit? What's the theory of the lean startup? None of them dealt with the nitty-gritty, nasty, gnarly things. How do I actually do a startup? Because the assumption was that was all like little chicken little stuff, and you didn't need to do that while they concentrated on the big stuff. So I said, well, it turns out based on all the companies that I've seen starting up and through all the accelerators I work with and the entrepreneurship programs and the angel investing I do, most of them end up getting it wrong when they try and do the little stuff, how to start up. And so every time we've done a startup investment, and I've invested, as you know, in over 100 companies at this point, you invariably end up redoing all the stuff they did wrong the first time, changing them from an LLC to a Delaware C Corp, and figuring out, you just can't promise somebody equity. You actually got to give them an option grant and so on. So I said, okay, what the world does need, clearly, is a how-to book, which was like the first step, but for the high growth entrepreneur, which was a second group. And so that's what the startup checklist was all about. And the subtitle is 25 Steps to a Scalable High Growth Business. So it's not designed for the American small business person, and it's not all the high concept. I actually point you to all those other books. I have a whole reading list in Appendix A that points you to everything from Eric Ries and Steve Blank and all those other great books out there. And this book was designed for the get down and get dirty and roll up your sleeves, and here's what you do. Here's how you do your plan. Here's how you do. Here's what kind of entity you want to be. Here's how you find a lawyer and measure it, and so on and so forth.
And so if I put myself in the shoes of most entrepreneurs that I've talked to, step one for creating a startup is funding, right?
Oh, well, the good news for me as the CEO of Gust is that, of course, that's what everybody thinks.
Yeah.
The bad news for entrepreneurs, of course, that's almost the last step, right? If you read the blogosphere and listen to wonderful podcasts, the assumption is, because, of course, people you have on the show mostly are people who are successful entrepreneurs or investors. So the assumption is, of course, everybody who starts in a garage becomes Steve Jobs or Steve Wozniak or Richard Branson or, Bill Gates or Elon Musk or whatever. And we can all reel off the entire, pantheon of entrepreneurial saints in our sleep. And so it has been ingrained into the consciousness of the startup zeitgeist that, of course, you start a company in your garage and 30 seconds later, somehow angels drop down from heaven and give you a few $1,000,000. And the next thing you know, you go public. And so because that has so ingrained itself into our psyche, there was an old saying, the first thing you do with a startup is you design the T-shirt, which is in large part true, but except that's been supplanted these days by the first thing you do with a startup is you have your idea, you come up with a name for your company, and then you go find an angel investor. So the bad news is that doesn't work that way. And actually only 1 in 40 companies that seek angel investments, 1 out of 40, 2.5% actually get angel investment. And when you look at venture capital funding, it's 1 out of 400. So it's the way exception. 98.5% of companies never, ever, ever get an angel investment. And yet everybody is convinced that, of course, when you get a VC and go public. So the good news for me running Gust is, of course, Gust is the world's biggest platform connecting startups and investors. So the first thing anybody does when they want to start a company is, oh, quick, I got to go on Gust and find an investor. So the good news is that we end up capturing everybody, coming on who's starting a high growth startup. The bad news is that in the real world, no matter, I don't care what your name is, I don't care where you're located, I don't care what platform you're on. If you have an idea for your startup, you're just not going to get funded because that's not the way the world works. Investors, as I've written many times on Quora and elsewhere, do not fund ideas. And the reason for that is pretty straightforward. That's because the cost of starting a company has dropped so drastically over the last couple of decades, literally exponentially. My first startup, as I told you in the last show, took $220 million in venture capital to get to our internet product ship. And then my next one successfully took $2 million. My first angel deal took $200,000. Deal we did a couple of years ago with New York Angels came to us ready to go with generating revenue, and they had put in $20,000. Now with an idea and back of a napkin and some part of the gig economy off of Upwork, you can get yourself started for $2,000, right? So therefore, if it's so easy nominally to start a company and to get to some basic level of traction, investors, when faced with 40 companies who have managed to do that and have managed to get their site up and operating and gotten some revenue and gotten some traction, if you're the one out of those 40 who, I just had an idea with nothing, we'll say, well, thank you very much. I'm looking at the other 39 first because they've actually managed to do something with the same stuff you had to work with. And so that's why in the real world, although we would all love to think that angels fund great ideas out of heaven, in reality, angels are pretty tough business people who are looking for companies with traction.
Makes a ton of sense. Now, before we go into what is the first step you should do, I do want to talk about one other thing which I thought was a really brilliant point. Because the second thing that happens when I talk to entrepreneurs that come asking for my advice, they all say, well, I've got this idea and it's unlike anything else out there. It is so unique, nobody is doing it. I think that, David, you talk about this in the book so well. Can you talk to us about that?
Sure. And if you think about, what percentage of the world are entrepreneurs, are entrepreneurial, right? Now, if you're an entrepreneur, you tend to think that most people are. If you're not an entrepreneur, you think that nobody is, or that these only guys on TV, doing it. In reality, most people who studied it and who are engaged in the world would tell you that roughly 1% of the world is entrepreneurial. I mean, people like us, real entrepreneurs who, live or die, succeed or fail, win or lose, we're going to just go ahead starting businesses because that's what we do. As Tara Hunt said in her wonderful SlideShare presentation, so you want to do a startup, it's soul-searing, heartbreaking, soul-sucking. So, why on earth do we do it? I don't know. I don't give a fuck on why. I have to do it. It's the only thing I can actually do, right? So for those people, that 1% of the population, what doesn't sound like a lot, except the fact that you're heading to a global population of 10 billion people. So 1% of 10 billion is 100 million. So if you're thinking about 100 million entrepreneurs out there, that's a lot of entrepreneurs chasing not that many ideas. So if you look at Gust itself, Gust at this point has nearly 500,000 companies on Gust who have created profiles and are looking for investment. Do you think that there are 500,000 different business models out there?
Definitely
Hint.
not.
No, the answer is not. They're not. Do we think that there are 50,000? No, there are not. Do we think that there are 5,000? Yeah, probably not, right? 500, maybe, right? So what that means is that right now, just on Gust, whatever your idea is, there are between 100 and 1,000 people doing exactly the same thing and looking for funding. So ideas are a dime a dozen, and ideas by themselves don't get funded. And for those who follow me on Quora, know that one of my favorite things to keep reposting every time the question gets asked is a wonderful blog post by Derek Sivers, which says that ideas are simply a multiplier of execution, and the core thing is execution. And so with lots and lots of ideas, you don't get any credit for an idea. What you get credit for is having executed and proven that the idea actually makes sense. And so therefore, the thing that investors look for is not the idea. You can take a second-rate idea, but if you execute really, really well, take, for example, the whole question of, black car limousine dispatch services. Well, okay. Like I've been, using an occasional, limousine service for, 10, 20 years, and you call up, they advertise at the airports, dial 777-7777, or you have your favorite one, or you have an account for your corporate thing online. So it's not exactly a blistering new science. And, the iPhone's been around for, a decade or more, and so on and so forth. And so what's the idea? Oh, a dispatch service for black cars. Oh, yeah, great. Congratulations, kid. That and Metro card will get you in the subway. Well, guess what? If you happen to execute it, if you take the idea of a mobile app to dispatch black cars to you and you execute superbly, you end up going from 0 to $70 billion in valuation in less than 5 years, right? So it all comes down to execution, not ideas. And so if somebody comes to us, to get back to your original question, and says, I've got this unique idea, nobody's ever had it before. The answer is, first of all, they probably have had it before. But if nobody has ever done it before in any way, shape, or form, all those 100 million entrepreneurs out there, not one person has ever done this. There might be a reason as to why they haven't done it. The analogy I love to use is my background before the startup world was in real estate. And I get pitched a whole lot of real estate deals. And so if somebody comes to me and says, hey, David, I've got this great idea for a brand new luxury apartment building in Manhattan, right in the middle of Manhattan. It's got amazing views. People are paying top dollar for these high buildings. So I'm going to build this giant, 100-story tall building. And I've got a perfect location. It's got grass all around it and lakes and stunning views of all of Manhattan, easy transit, roads go right by it. My first thought is, there might be a reason why nobody has yet built a high-rise in the middle of Central Park. And so, many people think you have to think out of the box. And I'm coming at a industry from a new perspective, and all those fuddy-duddies in this industry who are already there don't get it. And so, one of the most frequent things that I see as a problem is somebody coming from outside, some bright young whippersnapper, as we all think of ourselves, who has a new idea to revolutionize somebody else's industry that they really don't know. And there's a reason generally why these things typically don't work. But that being said, ideas are great and they're a necessary part of the business that you're doing, but they almost are secondary to execution.
So one last question before we dive into the checklist itself. You mentioned that there was this white space for practical advice targeted at entrepreneurs building scalable companies. And obviously, in your investing activity, you've seen the problems that entrepreneurs get themselves into, right? The elephant traps they get trapped in that are practical and that could be avoided. What are the most important, most common mistakes that you see entrepreneurs make every day that the checklist will help them avoid?
Well, that's a good question. The answer is read the whole checklist. All 20. People have seen every single one of the 25 steps. But I mean, and they range from sort of the simple that can be corrected. So, for example, if you incorporate as a local LLC, for example, which is your friendly local real estate lawyer might suggest if you're starting up a little thing and you're in Omaha or whatever, your Omaha LLC, that makes sense. It shields you from liability, and so you sets up the company as an entity, which is fine. The only problem you'll find is that with an LLC, you can't sell shares of stock. Is it possible to get an investor in an LLC? Yeah, but is it very difficult? Yes, very much so. You can't issue options with an LLC because there are no shares of stock to underlie it. Can you provide equity in your company with an LLC? Oh, maybe. It's doable, but it's really expensive and convoluted, and it's not a standard, stock options. So therefore, what might make sense for you as a single practitioner, dog walker or graphic designer, does not make sense if you're trying to create a company that will eventually need either investors or employees compensated with options, right? So, incorporating wrong, the first way, either, not incorporating in Delaware. I mean, you can incorporate in every state in the union. They all have, their corporate laws and stuff, except that Delaware has set itself up as this little tiny state to be the company state. And so the entire state is focused on the business of creating companies. And that means that every lawyer in America knows their own state law where they pass the bar and Delaware law, because that's the standard corporate law. So if you want to have investors, they're going to require one way or another that you end up reincorporating in Delaware. So you might as well do it right from the start and avoid the whole mess and expense and trouble of reincorporating. And then you're going to be in Delaware a C corporation, so you can actually have options and sell shares of stock and so on and so forth, right? That's a very mechanical kind of thing which you should be doing. Where things get to be challenging, for example, is the question of equity. How do you divide the equity in your startup? Often people will do it informally. Oh, yeah, I'll get 10%. Well, 10% of what? You got to have an entity that they can get 10% of, and you can't just say you do it. You got to have, paperwork, and you can't just give them a paper saying you've got 10% equity. That doesn't. So you ultimately have to have a corporation appropriately set up. You have to have an option plan, a stock option plan, which says here's how we will issue it. You then have to have an option grant, which the board of directors of the company, which by the way you have to set up, has to provide grants to and then you have to have a vesting schedule so they don't take them options and quit the next day owning a whole part of your company. So there's the how do you do options. Then there's the how many options should somebody get. And invariably, if two people start a company, the logical thing to do, the intuitive thing is say 50-50, we're each 50-50 partners. And I suggest in the book that doesn't make a lot of sense. That's not the way to do it. Because even if you're co-founders, somebody ultimately has to be the call. I don't care if you're Jobs and Wozniak. I don't care if you're Gates and Ballmer. Somebody has to be the final buck stops here. And so it's got to be 51-49, or you can do the economic stuff differently, but somebody has control. So how you split that equity is one thing. And then once you start bringing on staffers, what's the difference between, a founder, a co-founder, and your first tech employee, right? Are you hiring a CTO? Is it even a CTO or is it a programmer? Does that person get equity? Do they get the same equity as you as the founder? Or are you paying them a salary? Well, what's the trade-off between salary and equity, and how do you do that? And should somebody get the economic value of the salary they're getting in equity? Well, no, that's not really fair for a bunch of reasons we discussed in the book. And so those kinds of issues are often, gotten wrong. So corporate stuff and the equity stuff. And then one of the things that you've learned from doing, and it's hard to tell somebody else until they actually make the same mistakes. I know, Lucas, you and I have gone back and forth over all those screw-ups that we've both done many times, and at least one of us continue to do the same stupid things again and again and again.
Absolutely.
And I rarely learn from my own book or your book for that matter. As a matter of fact, when my folks in the company read this new book, Startup Checklist, the first question that came to me was, "That's a great book. We all love it. It makes so much sense. So how come you don't do that?" That's what you're saying in there. Okay, I'm trying. I'm really trying hard. So, one of the first things that entrepreneurs do, and mistakes you make, and I've done this every single time virtually, is it sounds completely contradictory. You move too fast and you move too slow, and you do both of them simultaneously. And so, by moving too fast, I mean, oh, I got an idea. Quick, I'm going to jump in and do it. So I start doing the whole thing without even really having thought through, what's the business model, what's the long-term plan, how is this going to work? But then the too slowly is, wait, I'm going to do it. And so now, of course, I have to plan out do the entire thing at once, and I'm going to do it, a 2-year, here's my tech plan, and I'm going to start building, and I'm not going to actually ship product until I get my 2-year whole thing built over 2 years. So you spend, 2 years building it, and then you ship a product and realize, oh, wait a minute, the market has changed in that time, and I really got to do something else. But now you're 2 years behind the time. So moving too fast and too slow are simultaneously the single biggest problems. So therefore, what I suggest in the book is you reverse that. And so on the one hand, you don't start the second you have the idea. Wait at least 10 seconds. Think about what the hell you're doing, right? And so that's where the whole idea of taking your idea and turning it into a viable business model using tools like the Business Model Canvas, which is a really great tool. There's a wonderful, and I point to all these books in the appendix. The book called Business Model Generation by Alexander Osterwalder and Yves Pineur is a great book that tells you how to build the Business Model Canvas. There are wonderful tools online like Lean Monitor, which we've recently worked into the Gust platform, lets you visually figure out who your customers are, what your service you're offering, what the economics are. So planning it, at least taking 10 seconds to plan and figure out what the business model is, that's really important. But then having done that, don't spend the next 2 years developing it and then hope you're going to pop out one day and everybody will buy it. That never works. Instead, that's where you want to get into the whole lean startup thing, which is once you figured out what you're doing, okay, then start with the minimum viable product. That means something that you wouldn't dare to ship, you wouldn't want to ship, but it's the anything you can ship. Because the minute you get something out into the marketplace, then you're going to find that your customers like it, don't like it, they want something else. So then you get into the whole build, measure and repeat kind of thing, where you start it, you see what the reaction is, you tweak it, you put it out there, you see what the reaction is, you tweak it again, and you keep going with real customers. So take 2 seconds to think about what you're doing and then start lean.
I think that's excellent. I think one of the things that I also loved about this book is that the way that it sounds like if I hadn't read it and if I was just listening here, I'd think this is probably a 900-page book full of stuff. And what I love about it is that it's actually a brief, easy read in the most wonderful sense of brief. It's got every piece of meat and no fat at all. So I think that I was going to go and say let's get into the list. I'm going to say let's not get into the list. You got to go pick up the book if you want to the list. So and there's no excuse to not pick it up.
I really appreciate that. There's actually, we've actually put the after chapter 25, the last page says, okay, now that you've read the book, now you can actually go online to Gust, and we have created a whole website around the book. It's gust.com/checklist, which gives you a sort of visual view of what the 25 steps are, and then points you to various tools that you can use that I discussed in the book to implement those various kinds of things. We'll be adding more of them over time, some really cool stuff to make it efficient and fast and effective. But it's essentially, so not to leave everybody totally guessing, there are three major sections of the book. The first part is to prepare, and that's how do you get started, and stuff you can do before you become an actual entity. And that's things like figuring out the competition, figuring out your business model, writing a plan, so not a whole big long written textual plan, but figuring out what you're aiming at in terms of conversion rates and numbers and economics, figuring out who your partners are, figure out how the ecosystem can help you with networking with other people there, build your founding team, create online profiles on Gust and other places so people can actually find you, get your pitch deck going so you can actually talk intelligently about what your business is, do some lean testing, put it out there, get a landing page, do some AdWord testing, talk to various partners, get all that stuff done. And in this day and age, you can do that at virtually no cost. You can do that really, really cheaply without even being a company. Just throw up a web page and a website, and you're good to go. But then once all that has proven, after you've talked to industry experts and figured out what you're doing, that there is a business there, then the next section of the book is all about, okay, how do you actually start? And that's, the incorporation in Delaware, and what's a Delaware registered agent, and why do you need one, and what kind of accounting software should you set up to actually track your ins and outs, and what's the difference between a merchant account and a credit card account, and who are the various players, and all that kind of stuff. And that's the nitty-gritty, stuff that everybody else glosses over or ignores, but if you do it wrong, it screws you up. So this shows you how to do it right. And then goes you through the whole startup process and who the various players are, and how you do it, and what you do it, and what sequence you do it in, and how it all ties together. And then the third section of the book is, okay, having done all that, having figured that there is a business here, having gotten the business entity established appropriately so you can now go out and have employees and raise capital, then the third section says, okay, now that you're operating, here's how you find investors, here's how you structure deals with investors. It includes a whole annotated term sheet to walk you through the kind of things you and your investors will be looking for. Where do you find these angels? How do you hire employees? The idea of the whole job hiring board, like the NFL draft board, is really interesting and important. How do you then do the analytics on an ongoing basis to measure on the lean startup all the stuff that you're doing, and how do you adjust appropriately, all that kind of operating stuff. And then, of course, at the end, having gotten funding isn't the end game, it's the beginning game. It gives you the wherewithal and tools you need to build this really big scalable business. What does scalable actually mean? How do you get valuations when you're looking for funding? What kind of valuations do you do? And when people realize that the fair market valuation that the IRS requires that you use to issue options is completely different from what the market says is a fair valuation for investment, and you look at this as a rational person, you say, well, wait a minute. I mean, if they're two completely different numbers, is one of them wrong? No, they're both right. Am I cheating? No, the IRS knows exactly what you're doing and says this is perfectly fine. So understanding what the difference is, how the difference is calculated, and what you need to know for both things, really important. And then, of course, the final chapter is how you head to the exit and figure out what is an exit. If you are a scalable, high-growth business, you're not looking at this as a lifestyle business. You are looking for an exit, whether it's an early exit, as Basil Peters would say in his book, or a long-term 10-year, 15-year M&A acquisition here. The goal is, whether you're going public or being acquired, you should have your eye on the ball, figure out how you create value in your company that ultimately will be of value to either a larger company or the public markets. And so that's what you actually are tracking through in the entire book.
I think that's wonderful. I think that, as I said, every entrepreneur should pick it up. It's 300 wonderful pages. It is not a hard read. It is not a long read, and it is absolutely every page is gold. So thank you for writing it, David.
And I would just note, in whatever form you want to devour it, it is available. So it's available in hardcover from your favorite bookseller, Amazon, B&N, whatever. It's available in digital format for Kindle and Nook, and it's even available in an audio format recorded by me, with me talking even slower than this. So I actually, although it amazes my family and staff, when necessary, I can slow down to give you a comprehensive guide. So that's what the book is all about.
And the checklist is at gust.com/checklist.
Yep. If you want information about the book and to buy the book itself, you can go to checklist.gust.com. But if you want to see the whole online version of the checklist and the various tools and stuff there, which is sort of your crib sheet after you've read the book, go to gust.com/checklist.
Awesome. Well, thank you again for everything you've done for entrepreneurs around the world, and thanks for coming on the show.
It's my pleasure. Thanks so much, Lucas, and thanks so much, Elliot.
Thanks for listening to the Craftsman Founder podcast with Lucas Carlson. If you like what you just heard, we hope you'll pass along our web address, craftsmanfounder.com, to your friends and colleagues. Be sure to check out our archive section on our website for previous podcasts. This has been a Craftsman Founder production. Join us next time for another edition of the Craftsman Founder podcast.